Welcome to the Digital Novelist Podcast. My name is Keith Hayden. This is going to be a special episode because this is part of my course in novel craft secrets. If you're writing your first novel or your nth novel, whatever number novel it is for you, then this course is going to be helpful in honing your writing style, how you create characters, how you construct really good stories. You can head to my website, keithhayden.net, and check it out there if you want more of these. Because the way I'm creating this course is a variety of formats. Some of them are audio, like this one. Some of them are video. A lot of them are video. And some of them are just written because I'm not in the content creation business, at least not anymore. I'm in the business of writing stories, mostly in the form of long-form stories, novels, and short stories. So I don't want to spend any more time than I have to making these things, so that's why I'm trying to keep them lean. But today's is going to be a little bit longer than the usual because I want to talk about villains. And this is going to round out this trilogy that began with the first two parts, which if you haven't seen those, well, you probably haven't seen them because they are in the course. So if you want to see those, how I create main characters, how I create side characters and side plots, because they tend to go together. And then you have to go and get your hands on the course. But today in this episode, at least for what I'm going to put out temporarily on my podcast and on my YouTube channel, is this episode about villains. I'm going to talk all about how I think about constructing villains, how to create a villain, and how to create, not just make a villain, but make them interesting. Make them to where you almost want them to win, but you know they're probably not going to win, at least not in the way that is traditional or that you see coming. And then finally, we'll talk about the number one killer of villains, and I'll talk about that at the end of the episode. Things that really make villains just horrible, trash, and boring. And we don't want to do that. I want you to write interesting villains. So let's kick this off with talking about how I think about villains. And it's simple. Villains are side characters plus. These are side characters because anything that is not a main character is a side character. And you typically only have one main character. But a villain is like a side character plus because we're going to see him or her a lot. We're going to hear about them. We're going to hear about all of their dirty deeds. We're going to hear about how they're scheming and how they're plotting and what they're doing and how they're taking revenge and how they're stealing your man and stealing that woman. All of the shit that they do. We're going to hear about them a lot. So we have to build up the villain. And part of that, the first thing I wrote down is getting into the villain mindset. With that thought, the first reason why I think we get a lot of bad villains is most of us, including probably you, are just too damn nice. We are too nice. We are taught from very, very young ages to be nice people and kind people and courteous and never steal, lie, cheat, all those things. But when you're writing a villain, that really comes to hurt you, and it hurts your villain because you just can't take it there. You're so interested in telling the story of the main character and because the main character, especially if this is your first novel or you're early in your writing career, the main character is probably a spitting reflection of you. They're probably very much related to your personal story, your personal struggles, and of course, you've got that main character glow, right? So you're not going to cast yourself in a dark light. You're certainly not going to, you don't think of yourself as a bad guy or a bad girl. So you don't dare to walk on the wild side. And this is one of the early reasons why you get bad villains, is because it's not because people are bad writers or that they're unimaginative, so to speak. It's just you don't think of yourself as a bad person. So when it comes to getting in the mindset of a bad person, actually, let me say a person who does bad things, because there is a difference. When it comes to getting into that mindset, you have a hard time. And that's natural because most societies around the world don't bring people up to be bad people. They bring them up to be good people. But now you're a novelist, or now you're a fiction writer, and you want to write a good villain. So this is the first thing you need to at least be able to shed temporarily and really think about. I wrote down, think of the times when you hurt someone, even inadvertently. This is another way to really get into the victim mindset, or into the villain mindset, I should say. Because whether you like it or not, maybe I'm the first to tell you this, but you're a villain in somebody's eyes. I know it's hard. I know it's hard to take. I know it doesn't feel good. Maybe you felt your heart skip a little bit when I said that to you. But you know deep down you've done things that have hurt other people. You've said stupid things. You've certainly thought cruel or mean or nasty things. And maybe you never acted on them. Maybe you shoved them so down deep. Or maybe you went to church, or you read a book, or went on a long run, or did what you do to make the bad thoughts go away. But my point is, you have hurt somebody. And I think this was a little bit easier for me because I've worked in professions that are, first of all, I'm black. So let's just get rid of the black elephant in the room. That tends to come with a stigma of villainy just by default. And not just in the U.S., in my home nation, but around the world. I've traveled a lot, and I've gotten a lot of just looks and things, and yeah, doesn't matter if I walk in with a smile on my face. It's just the suspicion, the stereotype that I might do something is there. So that's one. Second, professionally, I've been in the military, so that's one strike against me. Strike two, I was a cop in the military. That's two strikes. Those, being a cop, some people really appreciate us. Other people hate us. That's just the way it is. And then I was a math teacher. I went and became a math teacher. One of the most feared and hated types of teachers. It's about 50-50 when I tell somebody, yeah, I used to teach high school. And what did you teach? I taught math. And they're like, it's about 50-50 the amount of responses I get. That is like, I was no good at math, or I hated math, or something that's some type of negative response for being a math teacher. You're the one that sucked up all my school nights and made me almost repeat the sixth grade. That PTSD comes roaring back when I tell them what I used to do. But anyway, point is, think of a time in your life. We've all been in that time. Maybe you cut somebody off in traffic and you didn't mean to. Maybe you were staring at your phone too long and you almost bumped into somebody and caused them to spill something, or you said something silly without thinking about it. We all do this. Get yourself in that mindset. Get yourself into thinking about what scares you. I wrote this down as well to get into the villain mindset. What really scares you at the end of the day? What makes you really uncomfortable? And then go deeper. Don't just, worry about the surface level things, robbery, rape, disasters. Think about why those things are scary. Not just the act or the event in themselves, but why are they scary? And then you're starting to get warmer about how you can put together a good villain. Let's go to the next part. Let's talk about how to create a villain, because those first part, that was just a kind of a warm up. Those are just exercises to get you in the mindset. And I knew that I was going to struggle with this. Growing up military, and I was GRTC champion. I had dozens of badges gleaming on my uniform, and I remember I won the Citizenship Award in 2nd and 3rd grade and 4th grade and 5th grade. St. Clair Intermilitary. I was a star citizen. You weren't going to take that away from me. But I knew I was going to have trouble in my first novel, getting into that mindset. So I remember actually sitting down and finding a playlist on YouTube and I remember like putting on like just like Googling villains playlist, and it had all this this dark Baroque music and strings and dark piano and violins and just slow with backgrounds of creeping castles and all this. And I put that on when I started to write, like get into the head of my villain. Because like a lot of first time novelists, my villain was kind of he was meant to be a kind of a caricature, a knockoff of a villain that I enjoyed growing up, Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII. Maybe you've heard of this little game or played that very, very famous Japanese role playing game. But yeah, even the look of my main villain in my first novel is very inspired by Sephiroth. But I didn't want to, obviously my story was not exactly Final Fantasy. I had to adapt it, and so I wanted to add another thing. So I started reading about Hitler, started reading about Deng Xiaoping, Mao Zedong, all these people that are at the time during the first administration, Donald Trump, right? All these people that are, if you ask certain people by default, they are evil, they are bad. But I like to say, as I differentiated, nobody's truly evil. Even those people have a mother. They had friends. They had people that would support them no matter what they did. It just so happens they were at the fulcrums of history when whatever they did or currently. And a lot of people see. Now, this isn't to discount all the horrible things that they facilitate or are doing or did. But the point is, and I'll get into this later, about how to make your villain more interesting. Having this mindset. But let's talk about how to create a villain. Here's a strategy that you can use. The main protagonist, the opposite of what the main protagonist wants. If she wants to save her kingdom, then the villain wants to destroy the kingdom. If he wants to solve the case, then the villain is either the killer or wants to prevent him from solving the case because of XY reasons. You get where this is going. This is pretty easy. This is villain 101. If you're having no ideas at all, this is a great place to start. Just what does your protagonist want? Make the villain want the opposite and start building from there. Second strategy you can use is the main protagonist's greatest fear. And we talked about what scares you. Now let's talk about what scares your main protagonist in your story. Are they afraid of the dark? So maybe, and this is a classic one, maybe your villain represents that darkness, right? It could be physical darkness, like the absence of light, or it can be internal darkness, right? Maybe that dark side. And this is a classic one. This goes back to what I said at the beginning, how we all are brought up to be good people, and just even looking at the dark sides of ourselves makes us feel like bad people. So tapping into your protagonist fears is a good way. And then I wrote down the 3 Ps, which you'll hear me repeat. And if you've listened to or watched my previous videos in this course, then these are going to be repeat. But perspective, position, and purpose. Your villain definitely has to have an original perspective. They need to be in a position to where they would feasibly be against the main protagonist. It helps if it doesn't just come out of nowhere. We've all known stories that have done this. Just make the villain just kind of appear out of nowhere, and it's just like, well, where the fuck did she come from? Where did he come from? Doesn't make sense. You got to make it make sense. And then purpose. What is their purpose? What do they want to achieve out of their own story, right? Not just in the context of the main protagonist, but in their own life. And this is where you start getting into more advanced villain design, because when you actually make the villain an independent character instead of just a a matchup to the main protagonist, now we're getting somewhere because they actually have something that they are fighting for the opposite. Now we're not going to see as much of that fight as we do with the protagonist. We may not even see the result of that fight, right? Because typically villains lose in most stories. But we want to make that loss as interesting as possible. And now this is a good transition to talk about how I design my villains and how I think I've designed some pretty good villains in my novels that I've written so far. How to make your villains interesting and memorable. The first thing is to create a good backstory. And then I wrote in parentheses, but don't over rely on it. And we all know the over reliance on the villain backstory of, the one that comes to mind. I don't know why this is coming to mind, but Sid, what's his name? Syndrome from The Incredibles. How he always wanted to be one of he always looked up to Mr. Incredible, but he kind of blew him off when he was a kid because he wasn't special. He had no abilities. He wasn't a super. But then he makes himself Syndrome. He gives himself his powers, and then, his arc is he wanted acceptance. That's what he wanted. And he didn't have that. The equivalent of basically a daddy issue. That's what I think. And then this is the story. Now, The Incredibles is a kid movie, and I like The Incredibles. It's a good movie. But this is a very simple way to create a villain, right? And that's all there is to it with Sid's story. There's no other anything else with it. And it's not supposed to be deep. It's not supposed to be that deep. But my point is, this is a very simplistic design, and obviously Sid is somewhat memorable because The Incredibles is now a 2-decade-year-old film, and I don't know why it came to the top of my head. Oh, I think it's because there's a character named Sid in a novel that I just read. But anyway, so don't over rely on the backstory, but you need to create a good one, and it needs to be more detailed than an ordinary side character, because this backstory leads up to why the villain is doing what they're doing in the story, especially if they play a huge part in it. I just think of Harry Potter, right? With Voldemort. Voldemort has a very extensive backstory, and we actually go back in time and see how he develops later on in the series, and that makes him a lot more interesting, right? Because he's not just this villainous wizard who murders parents and children in the crib, right? He's actually has motivations, and I forget what they are. I haven't read the whole series in a while, but I just remember there's a lot of backstory. Next is to give the villain, this is another step in making your villains memorable. Give them desirable traits and show them using them for good. This is advanced villain design, folks, because I feel like most writers in movies and in any medium don't do the second step. They give them desirable traits, but we don't really see the villain's powers or abilities used in a way that other people appreciate them. And it doesn't have to be that the main protagonist appreciates them, right? Even though that would be a cool, that would be kind of a cool twist, right? If Harry Potter, what if he secretly, he goes into Gryffindor, but what if he, low key really wanted to be a Slytherin and kind of admired that power and that drive, and was just kind of like, yeah, Slytherin, they're kind of dope. Maybe, I don't know, I think that would have been interesting. And of course he has the Slytherin powers, he has the connection to it, but he doesn't throughout the series, as far as I remember, he doesn't like Slytherin. The Slytherin is just always built up as kind of the enemy from the first book. But what if he did? That would be kind of interesting. So you see how this goes. Now this is starting to look how this can really take your villain and bump them up to the next level. And then I wrote bonus if the villain's desirable traits are traits that the main protagonist has. Because your reader has been conditioned to associate her kindness with her character. But what if the villain is kind too? What if she's also a kind person, just to different things or different people, but then she's still the villain? Then all of a sudden you have this kind of clash of values, right? Where they both have the same values and even kind of style, but the way they execute and what they want is different. Conflicting goals. So this is where you can start tweaking the dials. Next thing I said is present them differently on the page. And there's a lot of different ways to do this, but I particularly like this method because I think a lot about visuals. And novel writing, or a lot of novelists and fiction writers in general, I don't know how much they think about visuals, but I actually think about how the words look on the page a lot. Because there's a difference between looking at just a wall of text and it's all just words. Whereas, if there's numbers and there's different spaces and there's different fonts, there's different breakpoints, all this stuff. There's so many different ways to do this. I wrote down fonts. You can use point of view. You can change from, I did this in my last novel, to where the sometimes the villain, it's in a different perspective. Then it's kind of, the villain basically becomes the narrator. So you get this kind of predator-like feeling, whereas some chapters are just the protagonists and the kids. But then you switch over the villains, all of a sudden it's like, shit, now we're in the villain's head and they're narrating the story. It's like they picked up the pen and said, okay, my turn to write. That's interesting. Language. I did this with language as well. Experimented with this in my last novel, to where certain sections are written literally in Japanese. It's another thing you could do. Hearsay. I love it when a good hearsay villain is done. This is when the villain just doesn't appear much, but other people talk about them. And I love when this is done well. I love when it's done well, and especially if it would, like, I would love to do a whole novel like this, where it's like sustained, where they just never appear, but everybody talks about them. Everybody knows what they've done and what they're doing or what they did, even if they're dead, right? Everybody knows their deeds, and people are trying to undo them or stop them. Yeah, I would love to do a whole novel like that. I think that would be so dope. Writing styles. Maybe you change to, like, from a contemporary like prose to more of like a flowery Shakespearean type, or maybe you just go super casual and the villain's super casual, or they're super formal. That's a common one. I feel like that's more common than the villain going casual, but to show their sophistication, right? To show that they can use all these big words and out-talk you, out-think you. A lot of people get on that cliche, and don't worry, we're going to talk about cliches because there's a lot of them. But yeah, just get creative and get playful with how you show your villain on the page, and that's going to automatically make them more memorable. The last thing I put down, well, the second to the last thing I put down, is to resolve your villain cleverly. What happens after the villain is either A, defeated, banished, ruined, killed, whatever? Don't just end them, because that's where most stories end, right? Like when the villain is slain, or they're put out, or they lose their chance at the job, or they get kicked out of the dance or kicked out of school, whatever, then the story's over. Main protagonist triumphs and we all get a beer at the bar. What happens to him? Where did she go after she lost? She didn't win the man's heart, or didn't win the woman's heart. What does she do? And I put bonus effects if the results of the villainy are lasting and permanent. Because too often stories just end with the villain, and then it's just like they kind of never existed, and the land was all peaceful and everyone lived happily ever after. And we have the equivalent of this ending all the time, and it's so fucking boring. But when it feels like the villain actually left a mark on the hero, on the main protagonist, and it's like, wow, they took a shot and they got a couple of hits in, and it's not just physical, even if it was kind of the climax was a physical confrontation. They actually had to fight. It's not just that. It's more, and I'd use this in my first novel to where it's like, did he really truly die at the end if the main characters ended up as they did? If his influence, his legacy of what he did and what he stood for really still lives on, is he truly dead? And I love those types of endings because it shows me the writer just kind of went beyond and didn't just say, and the villain's dead, the end. No, it's like, this is what actually happened. Here was the aftermath of specific events, not just the events of the story, but the events of what the actions that the villain took. It kind of gives them it adds more completion to their arc instead of just saying, and they were bad and they're dead now, or they're gone. No, take it a little bit further. And the very last thing, which I've been hinting that I was going to talk about, the thing that will tank your villain and just make them hated for all the wrong reasons. Cultural cliches. And I put cultural because these vary from culture to culture around the world. And I put culture because I lived in Japan for a number of years. So I watch a lot of Chinese dramas. A lot. So I kind of have this, I'm American, raised in the U.S., but I've experienced a lot of non-Western culture, particularly in the East. And it's different over there, but they have their cliches too. But here are the ones that I just really don't like when I see in stories, and that if you center your villain around these things, and just only these things, right? And not to say any of these things can't work. They can work if they're done well and they're mixed with all the other things that I talked about in this episode. But when I see these alone, it speaks to me as kind of lazy and the villain's undeveloped. And story suffers because of it. Anything dealing with sex crimes, deviation, abuse, anything sexual in general that is not like basically uplifting love. And if the villain is all about they're a sexual predator, they go after kids, they rape women, they rape men, they all they care about is sex. You see this in romance a lot, right? The protagonist is a very sensible lady, and she's very sexually stable, but the antagonist is a freak. She is an absolute harlot whore, and she just wants to get laid anywhere, anytime. I'm taking it to the extremes, but you get my point. And men, we can be this too. We do. We be doing that dirty dog day. Point is, when that is presented as the bad guy, to me, it's just instantly, I'm just like, okay, this story is already weak for me. Just because it's so reviled, especially in our current culture. It always has been, but especially in our current culture, it's so like instantly repulsive to most people, I'd argue, that you're basically saying they're bad because of this bad sexual behavior. And I think it's just too on the nose. It's too immediately, you're just bad, you're just evil. Even the word evil, I'm just like, when I see that being tossed around, I'm just like, okay, like, why are they evil? Like, what's the origins of this? There's so many interesting ways to do it than just saying, oh, they just are a serial killer because they get off on killing people and watching people take their last breath. It's so cliche and so boring. I don't like seeing it. I'm just going to list off all the other ones. I'm not going to list why, because I'll be here all morning. Absolute power, way overdone. No thanks to all the superhero movie craze of the last 15 years. Bullying in general is also another one where I'm just like straight up just bullying. Like, I don't like bullies and all this stuff. I think that's pretty boring these days. It's been done too much. Just straight mommy daddy issues, if unexplored, right? I talked about syndrome earlier. If it's just kind of that type of thing, like, mommy didn't give me enough hugs, daddy didn't give me enough back slaps, then I think you can go deeper. War trauma, as a veteran, I think of this. She has PTSD, he had PTSD, the battle, and all this stuff, and it's just so cliche when it's just that. It's so boring. Like, come on. Greed unchecked, right? Scrooge McDuck, the just money, 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 money. Yeah, that's another one. In most cultures around the world, rampant greed is pretty frowned upon. And if it's just they're greedy just because they want to be rich and more rich than other people or whatever, then that's probably a boring villain. Evil just cause, just because they've always been evil. They're the seed of evil, something like that. Boring. Generic world domination. I put this in just because it does still exist. It's a thing. Just like, really? Like, who wants to rule the world? Like, who? Not in the sense of for any other reason but just to rule it, right? And this is what I'm saying. All of these in isolation without any context, and you'd be surprised. Maybe you're not surprised how often in stories that I see that these tropes are still alive and well. That's why I'm writing about them. We're talking about them now. So that's it for this villain episode. Think about your villain. Don't just say, I've got to insert villain here and then just put one in. Really think about building them up as a character. Think about how you present them. I always think about how I can make their entrance as memorable as possible. I think that's a great way. I try and do this with any character, actually. Like, when they enter the scene, I want to place them in a way that makes them memorable for the way that they're going to show up in the story. I think that's a good way to think about any side character, including your main character as well. You could do this. But for a villain, I think it's that much more important to say, hey, she's here. And, yep, this is the villain. And it's very obvious that this is going to be someone to be, at least look out for. Like, ooh, this is a different type of character. I love it when stories do that. So that concludes this episode of the Digital Novelist Podcast. How do you write villains? How do you think about it? Let me know. Send me some feedback, what you thought about this episode, and what you are working on, and if you're writing a novel, and I'd love to hear about it. As I mentioned before at the jump of this episode, you can find the rest of these recordings, these videos for this course, Novel Craft Secrets, on my website, keithhayden.net. And this course is growing every day. So it's best to get in now while it's cheaper, because as I record more videos, more audio like this, and add it to it, then the just price goes up, because this is just worth more. Obviously, it's more that I've talked about. So get in while it's cheap and early, and hopefully it will help you write a better, stronger novel. I'm Keith Hayden. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.